You're heading south of the Mason-Dixon. This is the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. Here is your host, Brian McClanahan.
Welcome back to the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. This is episode 53, the first episode of 2017, and this is your host, Brian McClanahan. Glad to be back with you. It's been a little while. Glad to be back with the program. And this episode covers the week of January 2nd through January 6th, 2017. So we're back doing our podcast on a weekly basis, and it's good. It's good, like I said, good to be back in the chair, and good to be back behind the microphone. So before we get started, just want to remind everyone that just because we've turned the page on a year and we've gone to a new month doesn't mean that we don't need your support. And I know a lot of people were very generous at the end of the year in helping us out. But if you're hearing this podcast for the first time and you want to help the Abbeville Institute, then please consider making a tax-deductible contribution to the Institute. We exist on your generous contributions alone, so you can go to our website and go up under the top there where it says support or contact, and you have membership options. So please consider keeping this podcast going, our website going, our podcasts up and, or our programs up and running. We do need your support. Also, like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, go to our YouTube page. Just before the end of the year, we posted a tremendous number of videos on from our two of our conferences last year. One on nullification in Atlanta, and the other from our summer school, which was on the Southern tradition and the renewal of America. So all that material is free of charge for you online, which is what also your generous contribution helps us do, and put all that stuff up there. Our website really has become a virtual library of Southern thought, and it's going to get better this year. So we got a lot of good stuff coming up this year, a lot of good material for you, and this week is no exception. So we had a number of pieces. We had 5 pieces as normal this week. We're back to that schedule. We had a couple of weeks there at the end of the year where we weren't doing that for some behind-the-scenes reasons with the website, but we're back at it doing 5 a week. And so this week we had an eclectic mix of things, and some things we've been discussing on the website for a little while now, and others just trying to emphasize what is the South. And I think that is one of the important questions we're going to try to answer this year at the Abbeville Institute. What is the Southern tradition? We talked about it last year with our summer school. We've done some conferences on that topic, but we're really going to try to hash that out this year. What is the South? What is the Southern tradition? And why is it important? And so we get into that a little bit this week, and we'll be doing more of that as the weeks progress. But the first piece we had this week was by Paul Yarborough, and he's written some great stuff for us recently, and this one was titled "See Ya, signed CSA," and it's about the issue of California secession, which has become front-page news, even on places like the Drudge Report, and major newspapers in California are talking about California secession, which is remarkable considering that if this was 2009 or 2008 when Barack Obama was elected, and there were people clamoring about secession in the South and the West, that was all seen as purely reactionary nonsense by a bunch of hillbillies who just didn't want to be part of a progressive administration like the Obama administration, and they were all just racist, looking to get out because they didn't like a black president. Well, now that California is talking about secession, well, I mean, hey, it's okay. We've got this evil Donald Trump going to be inaugurated in just a couple of weeks, and so we need to get out of here. This is going to be a disaster for America, and a progressive state like California cannot be tied in to these yahoos here around the rest of the country, and so let's get out. And so now this has become fashionable. Hey, because California wants to do it, it's okay. Now, Paul Yarborough talks about that, and how this would actually be great for the rest of us if California would just leave. And in fact, when you look at the demographics and the statistics surrounding the issue, if the only reason Hillary Clinton won the popular vote in 2016 is because she got about 2 million more votes in California than anywhere else. And Donald Trump actually won, from what I understand, the popular vote in all the other states. combined, right? So I think New York actually factored into this a little bit. So you take out New York and California, and Donald Trump's the clear winner of the 2016 election, both in terms of the Electoral College and the popular vote. So it's two states that are really propping up this idea that we need to have the Electoral College abolished and go to the popular vote. So do we really want to be governed by California and New York? Do 50 states really want to be governed by 2 states? And I think that's the question, and we've talked about the Electoral College on this program and on our website. The Electoral College was put in place to ensure that the states, not the populace, would be represented in the executive branch. It was a check on what John Randolph of Roanoke called king numbers. Now, of course, he called it that later, but this is what the founding generation was looking at. Should we be governed by a mere majority of people, the tyranny of the majority, which we saw what happened in France during the French Revolution when you get to that. And people were very scared in the founding generation as to what would happen if you did that here. They thought that, of course, if you had the general population running things, you would have some type of bloody revolution. And they feared that. And so this fear of democracy was an overarching theme in the founding generation for a lot of the members of the founding generation. However, they also understood that the states were the principal components of this government, and so the states had to be part of the process for electing your chief executive. And not only that, when you look at the way the Constitution was designed, and of course we have a piece on that later in this week, and I'll talk about that in a minute. When you look at that federalism, the states were still the most important component of the United States government. It was still a federation of states, a federal republic, not a singular republic like in France, which you had after the French Revolution, or a nation. It was not a nation. Now, people did speak in that language. Even in the founding generation, you had nationalists, but they were in the minority. It's unfortunate that after the Constitution is ratified, you have the nationalists really take power, and they start pushing this nationalist agenda. Now, it's not codified until later, until you get into the 19th century, and it's the war that really, makes this the language of America. Nobody talked about the American nation until overall, as the dominant theme until after the war in the 1860s and Reconstruction. And of course, we're getting up to the most important years in the sesquicentennial of Reconstruction. Next year, 2018, is 150 years since 1868, which really was the turning point in Reconstruction. And so we're going to try to do more with that also as we move forward. But the United States, as Yarborough says, will be better off without California, the rest of the United States. And California can go it alone. There's nothing to say that California couldn't be an independent country, even if you added Washington and Oregon, and people have talked about Nevada being part of that too. That would be fine. If a state, if the people of the state are looking to seek self-determination, then who are we to stop them? Now, I think the advocates of secession in California have some things wrong. They don't have to have permission from the rest of the United States. There are some political science pointy heads out in California who think that's the case, but that's not true. This is the American tradition. If the people decide through convention, now I would say they'd have to call convention, that they want to leave the Union, well, they will be free to do so. And that should be something that every American supports, whether it's California or Vermont or South Carolina or North Dakota or Oklahoma. Who cares where the state is? If the people of the state want to leave, they have every right to do so as sovereign individuals in a sovereign state. So this is something that I think is interesting because the question has never really been fully answered as to this particular process. War cannot settle a question, as we'll talk about in one of the other pieces. So on Tuesday we ran a piece. It's actually an older piece from 1982, but it's entitled J. Evetts Hadley in the Mind of the South, and it was written by Guy Story Brown, who just died, it was last year, the year before. He was actually one of Emmy Bradford's doctoral students, and he died in 2015. And the introduction to this by Clyde Wilson is actually in some ways better than the piece itself, but I think that the piece really does get to the heart of why J. Evetts Haley is important. And most people probably don't know who J. Evetts Haley is, but he was a great historian from Texas, and he wrote Southwestern biographies and histories. And so a lot of times these things are considered to be Western, when in reality what they really are is Southern. And that's why Brown is relaying this mind of the South and attaching it back to J. Evetts Haley. And so, Clyde Wilson introduces this, and he says very frankly, we repeat, the West is only Western because it is Southern, because it bears the impress of the culture of the Old South rather than the Old North. That is why Oklahoma produces cowboys, world wildcatters, country music singers, writers and scholars, evangelists and outlaws, and Kansas produces wheat and an occasional communist. So this is the important thing. To understand the American tradition, you have to understand the Southern tradition, and this is why we said on this podcast over and over again, the South is America. It still is today. In fact, at our summer school, Dr. Livingston had a talk entitled that, When the South Was America, and he stops it at 1861, but I would still say that we're falling short of what really is America. As we've seen in the 2016 election, the South, and of course with the West combined, and working class people in Rust Belt states, that's still America. And this is why when Trump, had this campaign slogan, Make America Great Again, it resonated with a good part of the American population, again, excluding California and New York, where people were saying, yeah, this idea of this cultural renewal is so important to most Americans, and a lot of that has to do with the South. So the South is America. The South really formulated what it meant to be the West. And, of course, a lot of those people, those working-class people in places like Ohio and Indiana and Illinois and Michigan and even Pennsylvania, but particularly in your Midwestern states, a lot of those people migrated there, those working-class people, from the South originally. So you have this very important cultural underpinning of the United States that's distinctively Southern, that shows that the South really is America. And he talks about, Brown talks about that really in this piece, and what these cultural underpinnings are. And he talks about things like honor, and how that was so important in the South, and how that notion of honor carried out to the West. And so when you talk about these ranchers and these cowboys and these other people, and we look at that in Westerns and other things in American pop culture, and how honor is so important, it's not a Western theme. That's a Southern theme that was brought west by Southerners. He talks about things like justice, and this pursuit of leave us alone, this individualism that was so important. If you go out west and you spend some time out there, you're struck by the idea that it really is a separate country in some ways, in that it's so far removed from the East. Now, it doesn't mean the culture wasn't brought from somewhere else, but this idea of leave us alone, and Southerners were pushing that more than anyone else. Leave us alone. Let us go our own way. Self-determination, individualism. This is something that John Shelton Reed said, was so important in the South, and was the cultural tradition moving forward that the South could really influence the rest of the U.S. It was this rugged individualism. And the West was so important for that moving forward. And so Brown talks about that, this leave us alone idea. You're a couple of thousand miles removed from the East Coast, and you don't feel like you're part of that. You're just so far out there, and you want to be governed by yourselves, by the people around you, not by Washington, D.C. And I think that's one of the important elements that the South really brought to the West. Clyde brought up in the introduction, it's why Owen Wister had a great story about Wyoming that he called the Virginian. The cowboy was the Virginian, because that culture of the Old South had been moving west and had been rooted in the South, and now it was taking root in the West. And so he talks about how this struggle against progressivism was so important to the cowboy rancher, and how they were trying to resist those things. and how that was an important cultural theme in the West. So you have all these things going on in the West that are brought from the South, and how that Western tradition, when you watch a Western movie or read a Western novel, how that really is just Southern. You wouldn't have had these things. I mean, Texas is Southern. You wouldn't have had these cultural traits without having the Southern tradition being brought there. And so this is why you should read these Western histories. And J. Evetts Haley has some great stuff. His biography of Charles Goodnight is fantastic. But it really brings out this idea of Western cultural independence that was predicated by Southern cultural independence and moving west. And so I would encourage you to go out and read some J. Evetts Haley, and of course read this piece if you haven't done so. It's quite long. It's about 5,000 words, so it's not a piece you're going to sit down and just whip through in about 30 minutes. It's going to take you a little time to get through it, but these are some of the things we're trying to do and bring out this richness of Southern culture and why it's so important for the rest of the United States. And I think this piece does that, and Guy Story Brown did a fantastic job with that. Of course, being a student of Emmy Bradford, you're going to get that. Now, on Wednesday, we had our typical Clyde Wilson piece for the week. We always have that every Wednesday, Tuesday or Wednesday usually, depending on the length of the piece. But this was entitled A Tar Heel's Revenge, and it's an older piece too, 1982. But what he's talking about here is the importance of North Carolina in the South, and how there was this misconception really in the 80s, and I've still seen it to today, that North Carolinians deserted in large numbers and during the War for Southern Independence, and they might have had the highest casualties, but they were also the greatest cowards in the war, and so they were leaving in droves. And Clyde references an article that came out in the North Carolina Historical Review in the early 80s that this desertion, quote unquote, had to be looked at. It's much more nuanced than that. And what you had essentially was, you had deserters and people who were AWOL. And Kent Masterson Brown talks about this quite a bit when he does his Civil War tours and other things. But, a lot of Southern soldiers would simply leave and then come back because they had things to attend to at home. They had sick family members, or their crops needed to be harvested, or whatever it was. But they would come back. And so AWOL was different than desertion. And you got to remember that, and I've seen this before, people saying, well, show me these soldiers, or show me, these people in the South. The South didn't have any regular army, so to speak. They had militia and drilling and boot camp. You didn't have that in the South. You still had things like that a little bit in the North because they had the apparatus put in place for a regular army. The South had to create this out of thin air, and so these men were just showing up, and that's how they were trained. And so you really didn't have you had a whole bunch of militia. Now, I know you still had that in the North, but what constitutes a soldier is the question. Is a soldier simply one who enlists and has to go and drill and go through a type of a boot camp, or is a soldier one who's just there simply supporting the war effort? And I think if you look at the American effort today, you have a large number of soldiers who don't do anything but push a pen or supply soldiers. It takes a large number of men and women now on the back end to keep one soldier in the field, and I think that's something we forget. Those people are still soldiers. They may not be out there fighting the enemy, but they're still soldiers. And so Clyde gets into this, issue of, how important North Carolina soldiers were and how important Southerners still are to the modern American military. You wouldn't have had, the Southerners have served as the backbone in World War II, in Vietnam, and even, of course, this is written in 82, but moving forward into the 90s and the 2000s, and how important Southern soldiers are to the war effort in Iraq and Afghanistan, the Gulf Wars. I mean, Southerners really have been the backbone of the American military, really since its inception. You wouldn't have had the United States win the American War for Independence, for example, without the effort in the South. The war moved to the South late in the later phases, and if the South was not so resolute in its defense of independence at that point, the United States doesn't win independence. And so the South has long been the most important component of the American military experience, and that is also cultural. Southerners, and that you can look at various cultural traits and where these Southerners come from, Celtic peoples, but also these Cavalier men who were honorable and wanted to have glory on the battlefield, or viewed the British idea of limited government and individual rights. I mean, these things were important to Southerners, maybe more than any other section in the United States, and so they willingly fought for them all throughout American history, even to this day. And so this is why the South is so important to the vitality of the United States. And, of course, there are exceptions to the rule, and there are great Northerners who go out there and have these same traits and really defend those positions. But Southerners have been doing it in larger percentages than any other section in the U.S. And so this is what somebody had questioned on Facebook, why call it Tar Heels Revenge? Well, that's what Clyde called the piece, but also to show that North Carolinians were not just cowards, and that the Southern effort would not have been possible, or I should say the American effort would not have been possible without the Southern military effort all throughout the war. Throughout all American wars. And so this is an important thing to understand in American history and also American military history. All right, on Thursday we ran a piece entitled A State of Mind, and I'm sure people, a lot of people maybe listen to this. The image at the top was a U.S. flag, and it's actually the Cowpens flag. And I was just talking about how important the South was to the American movement for independence in the 1770s. And that Cowpens flag, this was flown at the Battle of Cowpens, which was such an important battle in the American War for Independence. And, that is a Southern flag. And so, we forget that Southerners were the backbone, really, of this American War for Independence, too. I mean, without Richard Henry Lee, as John Marquardt talks about, without Richard Henry Lee, you don't have the call for independence in 1776. That was June, the month before we had the Declaration. Without Thomas Jefferson, right, writing the Declaration. Here's the South being so important. Without George Washington leading the Continental Army. Without people like Francis Marion and Thomas Sumter and others in the South, you don't have independence because they were able to knock out Cornwallis. And so this is so important. Without moving forward, without James Madison, maybe the Constitution doesn't happen. I think Madison is incorrectly called the father of the Constitution, but he was an important actor, and of course, part of the Federalist Essays. And you had not just the Federalist Essays, but you had many Southerners who were promoting the Constitution during the ratification process. And these friends of the Constitution were much more important, probably, than the Federalist Essays themselves. So you had this real push coming from the South and determining what the United States was going to be like. And then, of course, moving forward, you had Southerners promoting the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions and how those were picked up around the United States. You had this idea of state interposition in South Carolina, but that was not just, this was not just a Southern idea. Northerners also pushed the idea of nullification too. Even nationalists, people like Henry Clay and John Marshall, these people were Southerners, but they had a unique bent to their nationalism, and I'll talk about that in the next piece. Andrew Jackson, Southerner. So this piece really gets into how important the South was to American political history, and what we can gain from that moving forward in 2017 as we look at a new administration coming into the United States, the Donald Trump administration. And what Jack says is that one thing maybe we can get out of this Southern tradition and how important this is that what we need is an idea of federalism to come back to the forefront. We need to, even though we have our guy in the executive mansion, and this is what a lot of people think, well, we got our guy there now. So let's start talking about nationalism again. But this is very, very dangerous. What we really need is for the Trump administration to still promote federalism, because this is better for the Union as a whole. It's better for the leftists. If California could simply operate its government the way it wants, and it does. I mean, people don't realize it, but California does. They can have their liberal utopia in California or New York or Massachusetts, and they don't have to worry about what happens in Alabama or South Carolina. What we really need to be talking about here is, look, defending your hearth and home, your kith and kin, still needs to be the important part of American federalism. We don't need to be talking about nationalism. We need to be talking about federalism. If something could come out of this that could make that possible, that would be a victory for the Trump administration. It's not that, a lot of people in the South and the West and the Rust Belt won't support what Trump is doing, but we need to be sympathetic to the left and their in their defeat and saying, look, yeah, we understand. You lost. We're not going to punish you for it. What we want you to do is understand that, when you lose, if you put into place this very strong central authority, when you lose, it can have dramatic and disastrous consequences for you in your states because you've put this into effect. And so let's start talking about federalism. Let's start talking about the things that make America great, which is your hearth and home. This is where I've talked about on my own podcast, things like think locally, act locally. Still focus on the home, focus on your community, focus on your state, because that won't change no matter who's in the executive branch. That won't change. You have to still talk about those things. And instead of talking about a nation, and I know Jack mentions that term, what we need to be talking about is federalism as we move forward into 2017, 18, 19, 20, and early 21, these next 4 years. Let's talk about those things. Just because Trump won doesn't mean we have to stop talking about that stuff. And I think that if we have that perspective moving forward, doesn't matter who. It really shouldn't matter who's in the executive branch. It should matter who's in your as your mayor of your town, or who's on your county commission, or who's in the governor's seat in your state. Those are the things that really matter. And also, it really matters who's leading your family and what your position is on education at home and church and your financial stability and viability at home. These are the things that matter. If you can do these things at home, it really doesn't matter who's in the executive branch. It really doesn't matter who's in Congress. And I think, as we've talked about in this podcast, this is why Americans are angry. They're angry because they're not really represented. And so maybe the best we can get out of Trump is if people can start pushing that message and there's a sympathetic ear to it in Washington, D.C., maybe we can see some real change moving forward. And this brings us to the last piece, which was written by yours truly. It's actually a book review, and the book was Philip Pendleton Barber and Jacksonian America, an Old Republican in King Andrew's Court. It was published this past year by the University of Alabama Press, and it was written by a man named William Belko. And Belko is a professional historian, used to teach at University of West Florida. Now he heads up a nonprofit group in Missouri. But this is a wonderful piece because what it really shows, Philip Pendleton Barber is one of these forgotten people in American history. He was a quintessential Virginian, old Republican, served on the Supreme Court. He, in fact, was one of the best Supreme Court justices we've had. He served in Congress for a number of years, was considered for vice president at one point. And Barber was really an example of what these old Republicans believe, and I think Belko does a wonderful job in bringing that out. In fact, he says from the beginning, quote, Barber's political career undeniably demonstrates that subjects of an economic nature, rather than the efficacy and spread of slavery, dominated, determined, and shaped the great political battles and partisan attachments during the formative years of Jacksonian America. So he's saying, look, this defense of the Constitution, of opposition to the bank and federally funded internal improvements and all these things, tariffs, this was not some veiled defense of slavery. No, no, no. This was a principled defense of real federalism and what the United States should be and what it had been from the founding forward. And how important, Barber was to this push in the early federal period to rein in federal spending. And Barber warned about things like economic and judicial nationalism, which would threaten American liberty. He was warning about these things because he was principled. And he was also Southern, as Belko points out. Barber made fun of New Englanders. He made fun of Daniel Webster. He understood who he was and where he was from. But slavery was not the root of his Southern support for states' rights in the early antebellum period. In fact, he said, look, we shouldn't even talk about slavery in Congress because it's not an enumerated power. This is silly. Let's talk about things we can take care of, and not a municipal. He called it a municipal power, not a municipal power. Those are things for the states, even in the North. They're things for the states. Now, what's interesting is Barber believed that the Congress could actually legislate for slavery in the territories, but not in the states, which is why he was so much against the introduction of Missouri and Congress meddling over that issue in Missouri itself. This is an issue for Missouri, just like it would be for Michigan or anywhere else, and these new states that were being brought into the Union later on. But he does think that Congress can legislate for slavery. Now, of course, in the territories. Now, of course, many Southerners would disagree, saying that, look, that's not even an enumerated power in Article 1, Section 8 either. It doesn't say they can legislate for slavery anywhere in the Constitution. So if they can't legislate for it anywhere, then you can't legislate for it in the territories. But there are 3 points that I made after reading this book and wanting people to understand. First, Barber was a conservative who wished to, as he said in an 1830 speech, look at things as they are. And I titled the piece that because I think that's very important for us to understand. Conservatives look at things as they are, and they have always done that. They don't have some type of illusion about what America should be. It's about things as they are, and even as they look at things as they are, and they look at things, Southerners consciously looked at America as a great jewel to be used, and there was richness to be had. They still looked at things as they were culturally, and they're not innovators. And I think that's the important thing to get out of someone like Barber. Second, Barber's conservatism was predicated by his commitment to the old Virginia order and the necessity of permanence, meaning land as opposed to personal property. And so permanent things, this is something that Bradford talked about, the permanent things. Russell Kirk talked about it. What were those things? And that has to be property, kith and kin, who you are. Barber had a plantation called Frascati, which is still there, and it was a wonderful place, and that's what his country was. It was Frascati. It wasn't the United States. And going out from that, it was Virginia. And last, Barber was a Republican, a Unionist of the old Republican stripe. He believed that the Union was important, but he also thought that if the Union was not going to work, then the state should just secede. He didn't really believe in nullification because he thought that was silly. Just leave the Union. If there was a conflict between the states and the general government of a political question, then you needed to leave. So understanding Barber is very important for understanding American history. And as I say here, sectionalism is not really sectionalism in the South, and really what it was is unionism. And the entire time, Calhoun always said he was a unionist. What you really had was northern sectionalism disguised as nationalism, creating problems. We flipped history on its head, and we think that nationalism was always the key, but really was this federalism. As the nationalists started taking over, this is where the rub came. And that nationalism really was nothing else than Yankee imperialism. It was Yankee sectionalism that was trying to dominate, and Southerners were saying, you can't do that. So we have this wonderful book that, nobody's reading. It had no reviews on Amazon, but yet you've got these other books. There was one that we'll be reviewing in the future on by this twit from Princeton, and it's a book published by Harvard University Press, but it's on Southern influence in American foreign policy. And it has a number of reviews. Because why? Because it talks about how racist and vicious the South was and how awful it was. So anytime you have a book that doesn't have that, well, nobody pays attention to it. And so you should go out and read this. It's expensive. You got to pay $60 for the thing on Amazon because it's from an academic press. But it's an excellent book, or maybe your library can get it and you can read it. It's very, very good. And Belko has done a wonderful job bringing out Philip Pendleton Barber and how important he actually was to the American experience. Okay, so that's it for this week at the Abbeville Institute. Hope you enjoyed the podcast. And until next time, good day.